we're very fortunate to have to moderate this panel, and they didn't really relish the task of following on Ron Sims, but they took it on and they'll do a grand job, and with Ron Sims by their side, they'll do an even better job. So, Rukaiyah Adams. Rukaiyah Adams, this is your hometown, is that not so?
My hometown.
So, she's back home. Where had she been before? She'd spent time down in the San Francisco Bay Area, getting degrees at Stanford, a distinguished academic institute that's recognized by all except graduates of UC Berkeley. Well, that's all right. I went to Oregon State, so we don't give a damn about these guys either. Anyway, she also spent time in Oakland. She's, see, Oakland.
Yeah.
Oakland rules. So here we are. She's well versed in financial matters. She's the vice chair of the employee retirement system, the Oregon version of CalPERS, or what do you call it in Oregon?
I run the money, not the liabilities.
Oh, okay. She's in charge of money. She's the moderator. She's going to take on here the introduction of the panelists.
So first I'd like to say good morning, and what a delight it was to hear that Ron was from Spokane. So many times when I tell people that I'm from the Pacific Northwest, they say, there are black people in the Pacific Northwest? So now there are two of us, at least, you know. Good morning to all of you, and I would like to expressly thank Michelle and Jake, to all the elected officials who've come to Portland. I must confess, I'm a bit nervous. I spend most of my days in front of spreadsheets, but in case you checked the stock market today or in the last few weeks, I'd much rather be here with all of you geniuses than doing my day job. So thank you very much for being here. Would like to set a few expectations of our panel, and then I'll introduce our panelists, and we'll dive into a hearty, thoughtful conversation. First, our objective is to raise meaningful issues and to provide you with specific, concrete steps, applications, ideas that you can take with you for your work. Although some of the topics can be hard to discuss, they're complicated, they're emotionally heavy, we could talk about the topics conceptually for a long time. Our objective today is to be specific. So you'll find me asking our moderator, our panel participants to give us ideas that they've seen, ideas that they have, and so we're drawing out tools for you to take with you to use in your work long term. So I'll start with Dr. Benner. After I introduce you, it would be great if you came up on stage, Dr. Benner. Dr. Benner is the Dorothy E. Everett Chair and Professor of Environmental Studies and Sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. His research examines the relationships between technological change, regional development, the structure of economic opportunity, and he focuses on regional labor markets and the transformation of work and employment. Dr. Benner's most recent book, Equity, Growth, and Community, which came out this year and I understand is available for download free. At some point, I hope you tell us where, examines the diversity and dynamics of regional knowledge communities and their relationship to social equity and economic growth. His previous book, Just Growth, which came out in 2012, helps to uncover the subtle and detailed processes, policies, institutional arrangements that help to explain how certain regions around the country have been able to link prosperity and inclusion. In particular, my challenge to Dr. Benner on this panel is to bring insight from his study and evaluation. Dr. Benner, please join us on the stage. Our second panelist is Glenn Harris. Glenn is a friend, and I'm so delighted to have a chance to engage with him on this topic. He's been dedicated to issues of race and social justice for over 20 years. He's currently the president of the Center for Social Inclusion, a national policy strategy organization that works to identify and transform structural barriers to opportunities for communities of color, and to ensure that we all share in the benefits and burdens of the work of public policy. Previously, Glenn was the manager of the City of Seattle Race and Social Justice Initiative. Its mission is to end the institutionalized racism in city government. Glenn's work in the City of Seattle also included the establishment of the Seattle Office of the Community Police Commission. Harris came to government after 5 years with the Western States Center. Glenn is a member of the advisory panel of Change Lab, a grassroots political lab that explores how U.S. demographic change is affecting racial justice politics, and is a board member of the Philanthropic Initiative on Racial Equity and the Willamette Valley Law Project, an Oregon-based nonprofit supporting farm worker rights. Glenn is also a hometown boy. Glenn, please come on stage. Ron, we're ready for you too. Glenn, you worked with the City of Seattle. What were the most critical steps the city took to address racial equity, and what lessons did you learn that you are now applying to the work that you do?
That's a great question. So let me just say really quick, thank you, Rukaiyah. And it is such a, it's crazy to be up here wedged between Mr. Sims and Dr. Benner. I just have to say that. And it's great to be in Portland, which is my hometown. I just want to say this conversation in Seattle, I entered into work around thinking about racial equity in government, actually through a conversation around equitable development. And in many ways, I loved, Ron, what you were sharing. In many ways, you know, if we think about growth and development in the 20th century, growth and development in the United States was predominantly defined by race, right? We think about what American cities look like. It is the leading way in which we thought about those issues in the 20th century. And in that way, I loved how you put that forward for us today. I think the question is, will it be in the 21st? And so in Seattle, I think at the core of the question was, as we think about issues of racial equity in government, are we willing to spend as much time, purpose, and application as we did creating communities of exclusion in creating communities of inclusion? And that's not just a simple policy question. That's a fundamental approach question and a question of sustainability. And I look forward to coming back to this, but at the core of it, we recognized that there was a need to talk policy, to really think about how we put this into operations, a need to think about structure, some of the things that Ron also touched on. There was a need to think about what it meant to organize, right? To really pull folks together, both internally to government and, of course, in partnership with community. And there was a fundamental need to normalize this conversation, for us to collectively understand how we got to the communities we live in, and where we want to go to. And the very last piece, just have to say to that, and that we did that with a sense of urgency that's been missing for far too long. And maybe as we go in, I'll maybe give a few examples of what that looks like.
Why don't you do that now? We're ready for it.
So I think, you know, maybe starting with the infrastructure piece, we're not getting, and Ron, you laid this out so clearly. If we think about Seattle and King County, we are not getting to the communities we want to see. That's not going to happen in a 2-year period of time. And so it's fundamental that as we came into this conversation about what's the role of government and equity, that we were thinking about it, how do we do that sustainably? It also meant we had to think about it in ways that were about how are we structured to actually even get to those outcomes. And so one of the fundamental challenges that the city of Seattle encountered in these conversations early on is just how siloed the city is. Any folks here from city of Seattle? Give a little bit of love. There you all are. And that as a fundamental barrier, right? Community does not divide itself up into, you know, transportation. And we're actually housing, and this is actually education. It's our lives, right? And so to really think about development issues, it's critical that we're able to come up with policy and practice that cuts broadly across public safety, across health, And the fundamental way in which government is frequently structured actually is a real burden of that in and of itself. So in a very concrete way, one of the things that Seattle did and is in process of right now is initially really coming up with an equitable development initiative that invited multiple departments to come together and talk about how do we come up with strategy that really gets at growth and equity. And now is literally in the process of saying, well, let's reimagine an office that can hold this in a more comprehensive way, that brings these pieces together in a way that allows us to get to a different set of outcomes. And I think that conversation is happening more and more across the country, of just recognizing the need for that kind of structure.
You know, that's an interesting theme that we're hearing. Tom opened us up with a comment about different government agencies in a region learning to communicate, and it sounds like you're applying a similar idea within a single city or region or government, that crossing over silos is a critical part in addressing some of the change that's required for racial equity.
I think it's essential that local government does that to actually be able to do that regionally. Right. It's one of the fundamental challenges.
Practice in your own house and then
right.
You go. Okay.
Right. To even have those conversations regionally. I think that's right.
Really interesting. So Dr. Benner, building on Glenn's point of view, you have co-authored 2 books on topics that are adjacent to this, the Just Growth book and then the Equity, Growth, and Community book with Manuel Pastor. Wondering, in doing the work for that book, covering lots of metropolitan regions around the country, what surprised you most about the results, and are the issues that have been raised in our discussions thus far among those things?
Yeah, I feel like we're all going to be touching on many similar themes. I wanted to also start by saying what an honor it is to be here amongst this crowd, and also how intimidating it is. One is we have to follow Ron Sims, try and keep your attention. The other thing for me personally is that I'm actually filling in for Manuel Pastor, who was originally going to be here and had to decline because of personal reasons, but he sends his greetings to all of you. And so he's the economist in our team, and those of you who know economists know the kind of person who becomes an economist is someone who's very good at math, but doesn't have an engaging enough personality to become an accountant. So that is not Manuel Pastor. He's very entertaining. So I have to fill his seats. But in talking about our book and sort of the surprising things that came out of it, the book was really designed to investigate, of the largest 200 metropolitan regions in the country, what helps explain success where social equity and economic growth go together. And learning from those places that were successful and those places that are not successful, why weren't they? And there's 3 key points that I want to raise from that. The first, facts matter. Data matters. Now, you might not know that by looking at our current presidential candidate debates, but in fact, they do matter. And for us in the book, it mattered because we were looking at a series of case studies, but rather than going to the places that we thought were successful, which would have brought us to Portland and Seattle and other nice places to visit, we let the data drive where we should go. And so we ended up in places like Oklahoma City, Grand Rapids, Jacksonville. Are any of those places in the house here today? Woo! All right. You learn really important things from going to places that might not be on the typical academic circuit of places to research. And what emerged from those places, and this is the second point, is the importance of what we call in our academy's erudite way, diverse epistemic communities. The key point is simple.
Wait, can you give us
I'm
some plain
translating
English?
right now.
All right.
It matters not just what you know from the data, but who you know it with. So diverse epistemic communities, it's a knowledge community and what you know. And those places that have institutions and social processes where diverse constituencies are talking to each other do better on both equity and economic growth. And when I talk diversity, of course, racial and ethnic and income diversity is a critical component of that. But it's also, as we've heard today, the people working on housing and neighborhood development, talking to people working on healthcare and education and crime and transportation and all those other issues. And so the key point there is it's not just the policy that matters that these places are developing, but it's the social relationships and the connections that get built from that. And so the third point that I'd raise up is talk is not cheap. It requires investment of time and resources and energy and deliberate dialogue that does not paper over the differences in values and life experiences that we have and the conflicts that emerge from that. This isn't about holding hands and singing Kumbaya. It's about serious dialogue. But what it requires is a commitment to what we call principled conflict. And that means that we're committed to staying in dialogue with each other and recognizing a long-term destiny that we have together in the region, even despite our differences. And to maintain that dialogue requires investment in the institutions and the processes that can help bring people together over a long period of time. And I'd be happy to sort of talk about specifics, but those are the key things. Data matters, diverse knowledge communities, and talk is not cheap.
Dr. Brenner, that's really interesting. One of the follow-up questions, the knowledge community concept really jumps out at me and would like to tease that a bit. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you're describing something similar to what Tom Hughes has said and what Glenn has said based on his actual experience in Seattle, which is that you have to break down some of the silos to communicate. But are you saying that knowledge about what's happening is what matters, or is it that education and information within communities is what matters? Can we tease out what knowledge
I think it's some of both. And knowledge is really understanding what's going on, not just in our neighborhoods, but in our regions. And if you think about what's happened to the information sources in our society, we're down to less than a third of the population that reads a newspaper, either online or in person on a daily or weekly basis. People are getting their information from the internet primarily, from customized news sources or areas that share their similar values. We have, just as an incident of that, roughly a third of the people in the country today believe that our president is Muslim. He did go to a mosque the other day, so I'm sure that's helping to explain it. People are in their information silos, and we live in segregated communities. And so it's information about what's going on in your neighborhoods and in your regions in a way that is shared and is ongoing and developing over time, and that really takes into account the different life experiences of different communities. Let me just give you one example to make it concrete. Jacksonville, Florida, for nearly 40 years now, has the Jacksonville Community Council has developed an indicator project that tracks key social and economic and fiscal factors in the region as a whole. It's become an important base of information that key leaders in the region share. But they have also developed a process of creating community councils. And these are people that are chosen, a group of about 20 to 25, who commit to a year-long dialogue around a particular topic in the region. And they're chosen deliberately to reflect as broad a diversity of life experiences and ideologies and experiences as possible. They investigate that issue. Could be high levels of teen pregnancy, could be drug problems, could be how do we grow green jobs or redevelopment at the airport or deal with race relationships. And that group of 25 people have to study the issue, they meet with stakeholders, they research it, they understand it, and here's what's critical. They have to come up with a recommendation about what to do about it, not by our typical political process of getting 50% of the people to agree with me and then we'll pass it, but rather a process of sufficient consensus, where they're taking into account the experiences and perspectives and values of everyone in the room and figuring out how do we take that all into account as we craft a set of recommendations that maybe not everyone's fully on board with, but at least they agree enough with it that they're not going to block it.
That's an interesting point. I can't help but think that there's another panel discussion we should have about technology and how it can help in building some of these knowledge communities or act as a barrier and a further segregation force. But I wonder, Ron, based on your experience, one of the things I hope you bring to bear in this conversation is having seen this over a number of cycles in different cities and regions. And what I'm hearing Dr. Benner describe, and to some degree what Glenn has described, sounds timeless, which is that you got to know stuff, you got to talk to each other, and then you got to be accountable for it, right? Like that sounds like a timeless concept in success in government. I wonder if that rings true with your experience and if there's any insight that you have having seen this in lots of different places and then at the national level.
I think knowledge sharing is the difference between success and failure. I think that the communities where we, when we were at HUD and we had some grants, sustainability grants, where we basically went to communities and said, here are the members that have to be on the team. Right. And we listed a lot of people that had to be on that team. And at first people protested. Well, they didn't get grants because our issue is if you're not talking to these people, you're leaving a segment of your community out of it. I think sharing knowledge and then acting on the knowledge you have is important. But if you don't share knowledge, if you don't have a common knowledge base, a common database, if it just doesn't exist, you're lost, and you'll just make mistake after mistake after mistake. I think the communities that do it best are the ones, and you can see it already. There are a lot of communities that have learned their lesson, and I think are beginning to realize that there's secrets are to nobody's advantage. Having a common knowledge base allows you to create common assumptions and therefore a more workable implementation plan for correction when it's needed.
So it sounds like the gauntlet is thrown to the audience, that now we know that technology and knowledge sharing is one of the critical factors in achieving success, right? So that means that in whatever policies or technology you use, that should be one of the defined outcomes that's measured in order to achieve success. So I thought maybe we move on to Glenn with a question, a specific question about how you create alignment between municipal and community equity goals and foster a culture of alignment beyond just the tools of communication, for example, or a set of policy goals.
Right, I was going to say knowledge sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but to this point, I mean, I love, Rukaiyah, how you just stated, like, well, doesn't that seem to be like basic ideas of good government? And I think the answer is yes. I think it is. And I think the reason that we've led with race is because I believe it's our tensions around naming race in our history that make us skip over the fact that all we're really talking about is some basic ideas around good government. The fear of sharing some of this knowledge, of having some of these conversations, I think is frequently something that we butt up against. And so just wanting to name it in a concrete way, I think it is, how do we get to alignment? It is about communication, it is about knowledge sharing, but there's got to be a purpose behind it and an acknowledgement of why it hasn't been occurring in the first place. Right? So I think in that way, for communities of color and for low-income communities, massive challenges around capacity. And if we're serious about knowledge sharing, if we're serious about wanting folks to share their knowledge, we have to invest, whether that's government, philanthropy, or the private sector, in communities being able to bring their voice to the table. And that's got to be a long-term
what does
approach.
That mean? What does that mean? Like, what is leadership cultivation? I want to know.
Yeah, concretely, in Seattle, and we've seen it around the country in a number of different ways, but really recognizing that when we say knowledge, there's a lot of built-in assumptions that we're not actually talking about everyday folk in their communities, right? That we're talking about folks who sit in fancy places, right? And the truth is that community has an endless amount of knowledge, and frequently we really are horrible at tapping into it. And so part of it is recognizing there's a value there. And if there's a value there, then we should be paying community for that knowledge, that ability to bring voice to the table in the same way that we'd be paying anybody in this room, right, to bring that knowledge and et cetera to the table. So in Seattle went with a sort of trusted advocates model, really recognizing that there's great leadership in community. And it's not always just to be clear, I'm not always talking about folks that we all know are the chosen leaders in community, right? Going deeper than that. Recognizing the community have leaders in many different ways, and paying that leadership to help government actually create that space, that learning environment, that knowledge space. So I think there's those kinds of models. I think philanthropy is really garnering that, like, as we think about planning, we can't go into neighborhoods and plan without, and Ryan Curran said this yesterday beautifully, which is we can't go in a neighborhood and plan and leave without the assumption that that community is stronger for its next conversation around planning and around knowledge sharing. That should always be an end result when we engage in communities around planning discussions. So I think there's plenty of examples in that way. And the last thing, I can give a couple more of those sort of what does it mean to invest in that way. But the last thing I want to say is the other side of it, which is that much of the reason these conversations aren't happening, and I'm just going to say it, is because, in fact, we have a really hard time having this conversation in middle-class white neighborhoods. It's just the truth. And it's a huge opportunity for government to...
Let's be specific. Which conversation is hard to have in
about race, about equity, about what it means for us to be having a regional conversation about who benefits and who's burdened.
Right.
And it's not because, don't misunderstand me, it's not because I think that folks can't have that conversation, it's because we're afraid to have it, right? We did a survey in Seattle, and this for me is always sums this up. It was a community-wide survey, 3,000 folks participated. The question was, do you feel comfortable talking about race? 90% of people said, sure do. Follow-up question, does your neighbor feel comfortable in talking about race? What percentage of people said no, they don't? 90%, right? We are in an environment where we're all ready to go, but you know.
That's their problem.
And I think it's recognizing that, naming it, and then creating space to make it happen. And one of the things, again, just naming in Seattle, because it was such great work, of purposely going out and recognizing that community wants to have these conversations, finding folks in community who are willing to help host them, doesn't have to be just government, and giving people the space to do that. And in Seattle, a similar thing happened in Minnesota, but there was a national traveling exhibit on race. And in Seattle, in 3 months, we're able to have a conversation with over 200 organizations that engaged over 5,000 people in a conversation about race that included this conversation about what does race and geography, our spatial relations to it actually mean. We have the ability to do these things, but it requires intent.
So that's an interesting point. Now I'm going to go off course. So sorry, Michelle and Jake. I'm on my way in a different direction. So this issue of engaging on race with our neighbors and the perceptions that we have, one of the issues I have is that there's a group of people of color here who are ready to have the advanced conversation.
Yes.
And we are tired of the remedial conversation.
Yes.
So what happens, or what do you think the dangers are in communities where there are enough folks who are engaged, who have the knowledge, who are willing to share and communicate, and it's really the white communities, the white middle class communities that will be left behind envisioning the next evolution in the city and city power and infrastructure and a number of other things. I wonder what the danger is in that model, right?
I love it.
I mean, just to be frank.
Can I pass that? No, I'm kidding. I would love to hear. Yeah, no, I would love to hear.
Panel.
I mean, I think there's a lot of dangers.
I mean, one conversation we've had here is let's pick a zip code. and just run it. And so it's okay if my neighbor doesn't want to have the conversation with me as long as they live in a different zip code. In this zip code, we're going to have those conversations. And that's an odd thing to say in a place like Portland, right?
So you raised such a critical issue. I wanted to say 2 points about it. One is that in terms of the remedial conversations, I mean, that's something that as a white person, I think all of us who come from white middle-class communities have to take the responsibility to do that and start those conversations in our own community so that we take responsibility for educating ourselves and not expect others to do that. But I think there's also very real dangers that we face, not just in our communities, but as a society as a whole, when we don't do that. And you just have to look at Trump and the argument about the walls and the anti-immigration work and the constituency that's supporting him, right? These are poor white communities that are attracted to that message. And these are communities that are facing a decreasing life expectancy.
That's right.
For the first time in the last 3 generations, from suicide, from drug overdoses, and similar, diseases of economic crisis. And so rather than articulating and analyzing the real problem, they become a basis for a populist scapegoating that could potentially undermine progress.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, Mr. Sims, and I hear you on that, and it's something that keeps me awake at night, Mr. Sims, that you mentioned was the zip code the predictive capacity of data based on zip code. So we've been thinking a lot about how can we turn that on its head, right? So how can we turn the large population of unmarried and childless Black women professionals on its head, right? I'm paying taxes to educate children that aren't mine, and I want them to do well. So how can we focus our resources in a zip code or direct it in a particular direction? Does that give you heartburn, just hearing that there are folks that are starting to think about the role that they play as an economic unit and a part of our civic narrative to be more directive about the impact that they have on their zip code?
Let me kind of, if I can put some of the challenges we have in talking to people in the context. When I first got to Washington, D.C., it was people had been unemployed for the last 2 years of President Bush's administration. Now it's all the way through President Obama's 4 years and the next 4 years. So you have people with 10 years of unemployment. It means 2 things, and many of them are under 35 years of age. Many of them are people of color. It means that they have no skills now to re-enter the workforce, and it means that they're looking at a fairly long period of time. It's almost a sense of hopelessness. There's a wonderful book. Isabel Wilkerson wrote a book called The Warmth of Other Suns. What I looked at is one target on it, which was the riots that took place in Chicago and in Wisconsin and Las Vegas and other places where people just said, we have no hope. The difficulty in conversations that we're going to have is how do you go to a community and say you have hope when they say we've been waiting for 10 years. Right. You tell me where that hope is.
That's right.
Is it a job tomorrow? The answer is no. Is it, I don't know what the package is. Now, the conversation can get started. I think the issue is what will be people's way out. One of my last memos I wrote when I was at HUD was, I am really worried about the social and economic, not only social and economic, but also whether or not we're going to just have a lot of people get really angry one summer and begin to say, I have no hope, and you can't tell them they're wrong because they are absolutely correct. So the challenge we have ahead of us is how to give both the knowledge base,
That's right.
but basically, how do you see the world out of their eyes?
Right.
And I don't know what the trick is. Maybe somebody else could tell me how to do that. I just don't know what the trick is.
Well, I mean, certainly conversations like this and having folks like we have in the audience engaged in this narrative is the first step. And that actually takes me to a question that I thought I'd toss out for all of us to answer that will give us some concrete answers. But in the work that you've done in studying or applying these concepts to living communities, what have been some of the unexpected allies or relationships or partnerships that have led you to outcomes that have been positive in either the conversation or in the policy application?
So I'll start with one that's about the conversation and the other that's about the policy issues. The conversation one emerged from work that we did in Salt Lake City, which emerged actually as one of the most equitable regions in the country. And people think of Salt Lake City as being a fairly homogeneous place, but it's actually going through a demographic transition now that will make it a so-called majority-minority region faster than the country as a whole. Large Latino primarily immigration. And it has been remarkably open to immigrants. Undocumented immigrants had the right to a driver's license in Utah starting from 1999. We just got that last year in California. Undocumented youth who were in the country through no fault of their own had access to in-state tuition at Utah universities as of 2003. There was a major compact called the Utah Compact that was passed in 2007 or 8 that was about how are we going to have a principled dialogue about immigration and immigration reform that started from the principle of recognizing the economic contribution of undocumented immigrants to our communities and societies, the importance of keeping families together and not deporting parents of children who are here legally. And what made that discussion possible, I think, is a commitment to the long term. And one of the things that's sort of part of the culture of Mormon society and Utah in general is family and large families and kids. And what is the legacy of the community we're going to leave to our grandchildren? And that has led to surprising things, that long-term perspective. In San Antonio, the passage of increased taxes for investment in universal early childhood education as an economic development investment. The Chamber of Commerce supported it because they could see the payoff 20 years down the road in higher graduation rates from high school and college. Right, so when you have that long-term perspective, it makes a difference.
Okay, so the one-sentence answer to the question of what is the unusual relationship, it sounds like you're saying frankness about the economic contributions of the broader community drove some of the policy decisions and applications.
And let me mention Oklahoma City, because it's a fascinating case of a very conservative state and region where they had a kind of dramatic turnaround from very poor economic circumstances in the 80s to very good in the 90s and 2000s with improving equity indicators. Now, there's a long way to go. What made the difference there in this highly conservative state was a majority of the voters voted for increased taxes, not once, not twice, but 3 times over an 18-year period that was championed by the Chamber of Commerce and 4 different Republican mayors over time. Now, these are the same people that, on national dialogue were saying, we should be cutting government and reducing taxes and shrinking the size. What made a difference in Oklahoma City was a recognition that we need to depend on our own resources. They had tried to attract sort of outside investment. There was a major episode of a United Airlines maintenance facility that went to Indianapolis instead of Oklahoma City, and they were going to tax themselves to provide tax breaks to United Airlines to come to Oklahoma City. And they said, well, if we're going to provide tax breaks to them, why don't we do it for ourselves? And what's also critical about the increased taxes, it was specifically for major public sector investments in economic development enterprises. In the first case, it was 9 different projects.
Infrastructure, like development?
Well, everything from the downtown arena to improving the Oklahoma City River, sort of turning it into a really nice recreational space, to improving the county fairgrounds. The second round of taxes was all for education infrastructure, so new technology, new computers, new facilities in the schools. But what was critical about that is that you had to vote for the whole package or nothing. So if you were interested in minor league baseball, well, are you going to give up your minor league baseball stadium because you don't like opera? Are you going to give up the county fairgrounds because you don't like, the divestments on that?
And who was behind the strategy, the Chamber of Commerce?
They were the key leaders, surprisingly, and the mayor at the time. One of the things interesting about Oklahoma City, too, is it is an example of a regional government. And a real government in the sense that it got there through dramatic annexation. In 1950, it was about 50 square miles. By 15 years later, it was 650 square miles. And so when you pass an increased sales tax, you have enough resources that it's not just about one little project in your own little neighborhood and city. It's about significant investment for the region as a whole. But it helps people see the interconnections between the predominantly African American neighborhood, which was the first priority for the education infrastructure investments in the second round, and the surrounding neighborhoods and suburban school districts as well.
Yeah. Ron and Chris, Glenn, I would love to hear your answers to that question about unusual partnerships.
Well, regional partnerships are incredible. When HUD and USDOT funded, we looked for those regional partnerships that would tie employment, business community, environmental community. There was a whole list, and we said you had to have all these people in play, otherwise you wouldn't get any money. And that included low-income advocates, people of color. But the interesting thing in this country is history. We had 3 different surges of employment that impacted cities. First was when Roosevelt decided that he was going to say no more segregated, we're going to have a lot of public, we're going to rebuild America using federal funds. Second is when Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower announced the same thing right after World War II. And then the Baines Johnson. We got away from that. When I was raised earlier this issue about people being long-term unemployment, one of the things that we thought would happen with the recovery funds that the president had is that we would see people who were in long-term unemployment getting jobs. They didn't. I think we got to go back to the fact that public institutions and the business community can actually alter some really scary scenarios if all of a sudden they go to the people who've been unemployed for a long period of time and say, we're going to employ you. You're not going to get the top job right away, but we're going to give you the skills that allow you in the long run to be able to compete and have a job and have families and have income. So we got to go back to the fact that we're going to have to create jobs for people right now who are pretty unskilled. But it's been shown in this country's history time and time again, you endeavor to do that, it happens. Oklahoma City was one of the jurisdictions that actually did that because they had, in the African American community, no tie to a lot of other places in terms of employment. They created an economic center, I believe, in there, and all of a sudden they were required to provide those we call entry-level training. Oakland, California is another place that had an entry-level training, and when you have those, you really change scenarios in your community. And so when we talk about the future of cities, I would hope that people in this room would begin to talk about not whether you have a job or not, but if you do not have a job, how do we train you and provide that pathway? And the funds are available if the will is available. And it's in everybody's interest to do that.
That's a really interesting point. I think what I hear for the audience is that having a buddy in one of the data analysis units in metro or city government to help you understand when infrastructure spending is declining and at an all-time low, you're going to have some social issues, right? You have unemployed people who are unemployed structurally for a long time. And so 10 years after declines in infrastructure spending and entry-level work, you're going to have some problems. So one sort of atypical relationship may be for some of you to get to know some of the infrastructure analysts and folks in the state financing system that fund those programs to give you a sense of where money is going, whether it's you're at an all-time low for spending or an all-time high. The data analysts may be your buddy. And that makes me feel good because I came up through a quant analyst system, and those folks do see lots of information and they have insights that may inform urgency in your work. So Glenn, tell me, do you have any unusual partnerships that you saw?
I love the, yes, but I wanted to name something that you said a little earlier because I think it's something that we skip over in our conversations because it's not necessarily always at scale, but it's absolutely critical, which is what are communities doing themselves to reinvent their communities? And I loved your question about so how do we take the zip code and flip, what does that mean for us here in Portland to flip that on its head? And I think it's a profound question. Ferguson, just really quickly to the zip code piece, as disturbing as the Ferguson report was around public safety issues and policing issues, the most disturbing thing for me in the Ferguson report was that the zip code difference in Ferguson, 30-year difference in life expectancy, right? 30 years. So just naming that is to your point. And what does that mean for, middle class, working class, black and brown folks in those communities to think about their own opportunities to do economic development, to do their own opportunities of rebuilding their own communities. And it's happening across the country, and we don't talk about it enough. And I just wanted to lift that up. I mean, it's happening in Chicago, it's happening in Minneapolis. I know there's work to be making that happen here in Portland, and it's something that I think is really critical that we support. It's clearly not at scale, to your point, Ron, for us to really think about that being the only strategy, but it's a critical one that we really, I believe, lean into. Gets back to that power building piece. But in terms of other partners, I love this piece about the role of government. One of the things that has happened since some of the Great Works programs is that the state has submerged, right? And so it's hard for us to understand this, but in fact, 1 in 6 people in the United States actually work for government, or what's paying for their job comes from government. 1 in 6. Government is the single largest employer of communities of color in the country. Government is not only the single largest employer of communities of color in the country, it's the single largest employer of communities of color in living wage jobs in the country. So there's a huge opportunity there, and I think one of the things that we learned in terms of getting to unusual partners is that government isn't always leveraging the submerged state. So what's happening is government is giving dollars away to quote unquote private sector entities on a daily basis to perform all sorts of duties, right? And they're all necessary. But frequently, those dollars are not connected with any of the values that we're naming in this room. And so one of the things that this was a major challenge in Seattle around, in a very sort of, direct way, just around contracting equity. So for contracting issues Washington passed an anti-affirmative action measure in late 90s, and it was devastating. Basically the city of Seattle went from 30% women and minority-owned business contracts in 98 down to under 5% in 99 in 1 year, right, as a result. And so the profound question around for the city and thinking about racial equity issues when we started was around contracting equity. And we made a ton of policy changes. It was, let's do better engagement, let's deal with bonding or insurance requirements right over time. But the one that was sort of the tipping point was recognizing that this was not a sole responsibility of government, that it really was a private sector responsibility. And so putting stronger criteria on general contractors, doing the shared knowledge piece about why it's important to have thriving communities across the board, but being really clear about that the expectation from local government was that if you get dollars, if you are a general contractor, that money is to be spent representationally within our community, made a huge difference. And I think there's a lot of opportunities in thinking about our relationship with the private sector, and how we both do that education piece, and to be honest, at the end of the day, get real about putting teeth in it that makes it accountable, makes it real.
Wow, you dropped the mic in there. I'm going to leave it there. On behalf of the City of Portland and all of the conference participants, Ron, Glenn, Dr. Benner, thank you for your time. We look forward to connecting with all of you. Thank you. Thank you.